Good morning, class. This is Mr. Turner, and today we're going to be watching a short video or screencast on some issues behind the Revolution, or a time period leading up to the American Revolution. I'm not going to talk about all of this really in great depth, because this is something that you'll discuss more in U.S. history. But we are going to go kind of an overview and talk about really more the political side of this, not necessarily the revolutionary side or the fighting side, but how this impacted our need for a new government. So colonial self-government dates back a lot earlier, really, than we sometimes think about it. A lot of times we just think about colonial self-government, leading up to the revolution, or we think about government here in America post-Revolutionary War, creating our own new government. But really the colonies have been given a lot of latitude to make decisions for themselves from very early on. The main reason for this was because of the great distance between England and America. It was about a 3,000-mile ship, journey by ship to get from the Americas to England one way and then 3,000 miles back the other way. So it wasn't very practical for the colonies to have to consult with England, to consult with the king, or consult with Parliament after every little decision they wanted to make. What we call this is salutary neglect. This means that Great Britain, again, had left the colonies to take care of themselves for a pretty long period of time, and for most of the decisions and most of the needs that the colonies had. Colonies grew to be very independent from this. They grew used to this independence. Even though they considered themselves still British subjects loyal to King George III, they saw themselves as sort of, separate. And it will become a feeling later on that they were being treated sort of as second-class citizens by the king and by Parliament. Again, even though they were British citizens, they weren't being treated the same, they felt like. So again, this time period, really from the beginning of the time that the colonies had been founded up until very close to the Revolution, the colonies had been free to make a lot of decisions for themselves. King George III kind of wanted to change that trend. He wanted to put more control over the colonies, and there was a couple of reasons why he wanted that. He felt that anybody that didn't agree with him was a traitor, and he, towards the end of his life, he became a little bit senile, a little bit power hungry, and kind of let that power go to his head. But he felt that if you did not agree with what he said, that you were a traitor. And this goes back to that feeling that some of these monarchs had, that I'm the king, I can do whatever I want to do, I get my authority from God, and I don't have to worry about how you feel. What I say is right, and what I say goes. One of the things that he wanted to change leading up to the Revolution was that he wanted the colonists to pay taxes to defray the cost of defense. When I say the cost of defense, I mean he wanted the colonists to pay taxes to defray the cost of putting soldiers in the colonies, feeding soldiers, paying for clothes, weapons. It's a very expensive operation to keep soldiers in the colonies. So he wanted the colonists to help defray that cost, or to help pay for that cost. In the end, he became obsessed with controlling the colonies. It became more about his pride and the fact that he did not want to be seen as allowing the colonies to kind of push him around and tell him what to do, more than it was for any real need that he had. So I want you to pause and think real quick. Why were the colonists given so much freedom to rule themselves? And the second question is something we haven't talked about yet, but I want you to kind of think ahead a little bit and ask yourself, do you know any major events that were ending in the colonies in 1763, this time period leading up to the revolution, the revolutionary ideas? What was something that had been going on in the colonies that caused King George to raise taxes in the colonies and kind of change his view of how he wanted to treat the colonists? I'm going to keep going. I want you to pause here, take a couple questions or a couple minutes trying to answer those questions. All right, so 1763 is kind of, really where a lot of people begin to look at the colonies as sort of moving towards revolution, as becoming revolutionary and having these revolutionary ideas. One of the earliest things that the king, or one of the earliest acts that the king and Parliament placed on the colonists was called the Proclamation of 1763. And again, this was really just, the goal of this was really to kind of just control the colonists, to limit what they could and could not do. The goal of this was to not allow any settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. Basically, it restricted the colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. It placed military rule in a lot of these areas where it was kind of like martial law, where you would walk around and you would just see soldiers patrolling all the time, and kind of the colonists had to deal with what the soldiers tried to tell them to do, even though the soldiers really didn't have any political or political decision making. But this proclamation was really ignored by the settlers and by the colonists. They just kind of moved around and tried to move around as freely as they could. Sugar Act of 1764. So the Sugar Act is one of the first acts or first taxes placed on the colonies. The purpose was to help the king and Parliament pay for war and pay for new territories. All right, so I ask you a question on that, pause and think, what had been going on leading up to 1763 that had caused the king and Parliament to raise these taxes in the colonies. And one of the things that had been happening was what we call here the French and Indian War. Basically, England and France were fighting over territory in the colonies. Great Britain basically saw themselves, or the king saw it, as he was protecting the colonies from France. He was making sure that these colonists stayed safe and that their territory and their property was safe. Well, if you know anything about war, if you've watched the news in the last 10 years, you'll know that war is expensive. War costs a lot of money. Well, it was no different in 1763. Wars were very expensive, so the king and Parliament felt that the colonists should have to help pay for this war, and to do that, they raised and imposed these taxes on the colonists. And the Sugar Act is one of the earliest examples. It increased the duties of sugar, textiles, coffees, wine, and indigo in the colonies. It allowed for no foreign rum or French wines, which means that basically it limited who the colonists could and could not trade with. And we're not going to go into economics too much, but by limiting who the colonists could and could not trade with, you're basically limiting how much profit that those companies or those businesses can really make. If you tell a company that you have to buy only from a certain company, then that means that certain company can really raise its prices to whatever it wants, and you can do nothing about it because you're being forced to buy from that one company. Or if you might be able to get a price somewhere else for cheaper. Well, you can't do that because, or they couldn't do that, the colonists couldn't do that because the king and parliament were limiting who they could and could not trade with, or who they could and could not buy from. Smuggling became a very big business during this time period. Businesses would hire smugglers, or smugglers would run different types of, or run different routes to different countries to get better prices on sugar, on textiles, on coffee. And that allowed them to become very rich because they were basically cutting England out and going to a different country to get that better price. The Quartering Act. If you've ever heard of quartering, if you've ever read the or studied the Declaration, or not Declaration of Independence, I'm sorry, the Bill of Rights a little bit, you might recognize that term or have heard that term, quartering. What that term quartering means is that basically colonists were forced to house, transport, and feed British soldiers. They had to force soldiers to live with them, or they were forced to let soldiers live with them. They had to feed them, pay for their beer, pay for their wine, pay for their horses, pay for their tack, all those things, which is very expensive for these colonists who already don't have a lot of money, who are already strained financially. There could have been, or there are estimates that there were about 10,000 troops in the colonies at the time of the Quartering Act. So if you can imagine how many colonists would have been affected by this act. There was not, the number of colonists in the United States was still a very low number at this time. So a lot of colonists were affected by this. And again, this was a goal, or the aim of this was to allow, or to help the colonists help the king defray the cost of that French and Indian War and the cost of defending the colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765. A tax on any printed paper. So Stamp Act is probably one that you have heard of before. And again, it's on any printed item. It's basically, when you paid this tax, you received a stamp on your document. It could have been a newspaper, a contract, your wedding, or your marriage license. But you would receive this stamp saying that you paid that tax. That's why it's called the Stamp Act. Viewed as an attempt by England to raise money in the colonies without the approval of the colonial legislatures. All right, so that's important. I'll read that again. Viewed as an attempt by England to raise money in the colonies without approval of the colonial legislatures. Basically, what this is saying is that the king and parliament began taxing the colonists, but did not allow them a legislative vote, or did not allow them a legislative voice in debating these taxes. The king had forced colonial legislatures to disband and wouldn't allow them to meet anymore. And also, the colonists were not given any voice in the English, or the British legislature, Parliament. So basically, they didn't have any say on their side of the taxes. And what you've probably heard before in the past, which kind of becomes the slogan for the revolution, or slogan leading up to the revolution, is no taxation without representation. And this is kind of an example of what that means. The colonists were being taxed, but they were not given an opportunity to speak out against or debate these taxes. One thing that's not mentioned a lot of times is that the British were already paying this tax. This was a tax that the British paid in England, and that is something that's kind of missed in this conversation sometimes. But it goes back again to the fact that it's not really, well, the colonists were upset about the taxes and the amount of the taxes, but it was also the fact that they were not given a voice in that tax. They weren't given the right to speak against that tax. They were not given a right to have representation in Parliament to vote down or vote against that tax. So that really became the big issue. This was the first direct tax on the colonists, which means that um, the king and parliament placed it directly on the colonists, and they had no voice to speak out or stop this tax. So how did the colonies react? With the Stamp Act riots, for example, there was unrest and uprising, kind of across the colonies. One of the major events is what's called the Stamp Act riots, and that's basically where New Yorkers just rioted in the streets and they fought back and they burned down buildings and things like that. Another result of the Stamp Act was what's known as the Stamp Act Congress. The Stamp Act Congress, 9 colonies or delegates from 9 colonies met in New York to discuss how they were going to react to these taxes, to specifically the Stamp Act. What were they going to do to try and convince the king to stop and repeal the Stamp Act? One of the things they came up with is what's called boycotts. You may have heard of the term boycotts. Boycott is basically where you're refusing to buy or trade with a certain company or buy a certain product. And the goal of that is purely economic. The colonists were refusing to buy these documents or pay the tax and buy other goods from Great Britain, from England, until the Stamp Act was repealed, meaning that basically they were trying to hurt the king and hurt Parliament, hurt England financially. The purpose of these taxes was to raise money for the king, to raise money for Parliament to defend the colonies, to help pay for the French and Indian War. Well, if you're boycotting products, if you're boycotting a certain country and their goods, then that is basically what's the word I'm looking for? Canceling out that tax, because if you're refusing to buy any other goods, that country is basically not making any money. They don't have any income, so the taxes really become pointless. So what did Britain do in response to the Stamp Act Congress, in response to these boycotts? Well, they eventually repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But in replacement of it, they passed the Declaratory Act. Basically, the Declaratory Act just said that the king and Parliament could rule the colonies as they saw fit. Even though the colonies didn't have any voice in Parliament, that they were still subjects of the king, and that the decisions passed down by Parliament and the decisions passed down by the king, were law, were what was going to happen. The Townshend Acts in 1767. So these acts did not stop after the Stamp Act was repealed. They were really just replaced with other taxes or other acts, other restrictions. It was a kind of a blanket tax over things like lead, paper, tea, paint, and glass. Again, the money that was raised here was to be used to support British troops and to pay British royal officials in the colonies. In the Townshend Acts, the king and Parliament also suspended the New York Assembly, or it was a legislative body in New York, until they agreed to the Quartering Acts. They tried again the king was trying to disband legislative bodies, which by disbanding legislative bodies, he was trying to cut back and restrict the amount of power and the decisions that the colonies could make. So you're going to see kind of a pattern here, back and forth. The king makes a move, the colonies make a move. The king makes a move, the colonies make a move. Until basically the colonies get fed up with it and we end up with a war. So here, again, the colonies are reacting to what the king does. And they begin to try and boycott British goods again. The boycotts work. They do their job of cutting the profits of the king, cutting the profits of Parliament, really in half. So if you can imagine, again, these taxes begin to become pointless, so they don't work anymore because of these boycotts and the fact that they're losing so much money because the taxers are causing the colonies to boycott. The colonies began to circulate letters to other colonies trying to gain support, speaking out against the king, speaking out against Parliament. This is kind of, where we begin to see some of that revolutionary thought that we'll talk about. The colonies began to make their own cloth. Women began to sew their own clothes. So by doing this, again, they're not buying clothes from England, from Britain. They're buying their own clothes, which is directly hurting the king in his pockets. And that's the whole point of these taxes, was to make money. They began to take action against British officials or soldiers or British citizens who were very, very loyal to the king. And again, this is where you begin to kind of see that split. People start to take sides. Either you're kind of a colonial, you agree with the colonists, and you agree that the colonies should have more say in what goes on in the colonies, or they should have more say in how the colonies are treated, or you have those who are still very loyal to the king and loyal to Great Britain and Parliament. So this is where you kind of begin to see people taking those sides. So you begin to see British officials and patriots, British loyalists, tarred and feathered, run out of town on rails, which is basically just a humiliation, telling these people that it's time for you to leave. We're not going to put up with this anymore. The Boston Massacre. All right, in response, this is kind of in response to the colonists. The Boston Massacre takes place. A group of colonists had been protesting, had met in Boston to protest some of these taxes, and they began to sort of try to pick a fight with some of these British soldiers, throwing snowballs at them, hurling insults at them. So that side of the Boston Massacre, which you might have heard about before, is sometimes looked over, but the colonists did antagonize the soldiers in this situation. And finally, the soldiers became fed up with the situation, became fed up with the antagonization, and fired into this crowd of protesters, killing 5 Boston citizens. That's not to say that the soldiers were right for firing into that crowd. Obviously they weren't, but a lot of times we try to look at it as 5 innocent Boston citizens were killed when, in fact, they may have been innocent of a crime, but they weren't innocent, just totally innocent bystanders. There was some antagonization on the side of the colonies towards the soldiers. These British soldiers were tried. 2 of them had their thumbs branded, saying that they had been part of this and that they were basically had killed these citizens. And because of the uproar against the Boston Massacre and what happened, the king and Parliament repealed all the taxes but the tea tax. We'll talk about in just one second. Or the Tea Act of 1773. Basically, the Tea Act was a plan to sort of place a monopoly on the tea industry in the colonies. If you know what a monopoly is, basically, a monopoly means that there's only one company that's buying or selling, or that's selling a certain product. So in the colonies, the only company that you could buy tea from legally was the East India Company. This was because the king was trying to help the East India Company. The East India Company was a tea company in India, which Great Britain had a lot of, I won't say stock, but a lot of money invested in. So the king was trying to help the East India Tea Company get this 18 million pounds of unsold tea they had sold in the colonies. What it was doing was basically lowering the price of British tea so that it was less expensive than that tea sold by the colonial merchants. Now, if you're like me or if your parents are like me, given two equal products, generally they're going to buy the less expensive product. That's just, economics. You only have so much money, and when it runs out, it's gone. So you're going to buy the less expensive product so that you can make your money stretch further. Well, by buying this British tea from the East India Company, it was undercutting all the colonial merchants and driving them out of business. So what the colonists did was they began again to boycott or fight back against this tax. They began to turn back the tea ships in Philadelphia and New York at the ports, sending them back to Britain, not allowing them to bring that tea into the colonies. They left whenever the tea might have been delivered in the ports. They would leave the tea on the docks. Nobody would come get it, and it would just begin to rot. And also the Boston Tea Party, which is something that I'm sure you've heard about before. The Boston Tea Party took place on December 16, 1773, and you may have heard some of the story behind it before. A group of patriots or colonials called the Sons of Liberty went into the Boston harbor dressed as Indians and boarded 3 British ships, the Beaver, the Eleanor, and the Dartmouth, and threw over 45 tons of tea into the Boston harbor. So 45 tons of tea was destroyed by these colonists. 45 tons of tea, even in those days, is a lot of money, or was worth a lot of money. So in response to this, in response to the Boston Tea Party, and again, you're seeing this back and forth. The king makes a move, the colonials make a move. The king makes a move, the colonials make a move. So the king being the king, feels he has to respond to this action. He can't lose face. And it becomes, again, I said it earlier, it becomes more about his pride than it really is about anything else. The king was not going to let himself lose face to these colonies, these lowly colonies 3,000 miles away. So he and Parliament passed what's known as the Intolerable Acts, or also called the Coercive Acts, which did several things. First off, it closed the port of Boston until the tea was to be paid for. So no ships were to be allowed in or out of the port of Boston, basically shutting down, or basically crippling the economy in Boston and the surrounding area, which was the goal of closing the port. It limited town meetings. It limited when and where and how long and who could gather and discuss politics or discuss how they were going to react to these things. By limiting these town meetings, the king felt that he could limit the chances for colonists or colonists to come together and discuss how they were going to react and what they were going to do. By limiting this amount of time or where they could meet or who could meet, he felt that it was increasing his chances of keeping his hold on the colonies. Suspended the Massachusetts legislature. All right, so again, the king is disbanding the legislative groups or the lawmaking bodies in the colonies. By disbanding these lawmaking bodies in the colonies, he felt that he was increasing his control over the colonies. If you're not letting them make decisions for themselves, he was forcing decisions on them that he and Parliament were making. And British officials and colonists would be tried in England. What I mean there is British officials who were accused of wrongdoing, or colonists who were accused of wrongdoing, were to be tried in England. And this served 2 reasons. I guess one reason for the British officials and one reason for the colonials. The British officials who were accused of wrongdoing in the colonies were taken back to Great Britain, to England, to be tried there because they could get a better sentence or a more impartial jury who would probably find them innocent or give them a lesser sentence. The colonists who were being arrested, accused of wrongdoing, were taken to England to be tried because they would receive a less fair trial there. They knew, or the king and parliament knew, that if they were even given a trial at all, that the people in England would be less likely to find them innocent, more likely to impose harsher punishments. Sometimes they'd be taken back to England and they weren't given a trial at all. They weren't told what they were being arrested for. They were just thrown in prison. So you're starting to see a lot of things that we're going to talk about next week or after the first test that really greatly influenced how our Constitution was written. He also forced colonists to not only quarter soldiers, or attempted to force them to quarter soldiers in their homes, but also began to just post soldiers throughout the towns in things like taverns or bars or hotels or post offices, where this military presence is always seen. And the idea there was, with the military presence around, it would be able to help keep the colonists in control. But really what it did was it angered the colonists even more, because they saw this kind of as an invasion of their I won't say privacy, but an invasion of their decision making and their ability to make decisions for themselves. So pause real quick. Again, these questions in the first group, the first set, was not in your screencast either, but write these questions down real quick, or jot down some answers to these questions. What was the colonial reaction to the taxes and restrictions placed on them by the king and parliament? So when I say reaction, I mean in general, what was the reaction? How did they feel about it? And then what was the reaction? What were some of the things, or what was something that they did in response to these taxes and restrictions? What effect did these restrictions have on the colonists? What did they drive them to do? And why were British officials and colonial offenders being tried in England? What was the point in that? What purpose did that serve? Eventually, the colonists became tired of this game, this back and forth with the king, and they decided that they had to make a move. They had to figure out what they were going to do, how they were going to respond, and make something final happen, and end these taxes, and stop these restrictions the king was placing on them. So they met at the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress would stay together throughout the upcoming Revolutionary War and basically become the first government of the United States. So at this meeting, you had people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston. And these delegates from different colonies met, and the goal was to try and figure out what they were going to do, how they were going to respond to the way the king and parliament was treating them. And basically, what they determined was that they were going to declare their independence from Great Britain, that this government, the king and parliament, were no longer serving their needs, justly and fairly, and that warranted an overthrow of the government and starting their own independent nation. So 56 men signed what would become known as the Declaration of Independence. In signing this, they basically were committing treason. These guys were speaking out against the king, saying that now these colonies are no longer part of Great Britain. They are free and independent states, a free and independent nation. And again, that is treason. That's speaking out against and advocating the overthrow of the government. And even today, in many countries, treason is punishable by life in prison or even death. And these men, if they had been captured, or if the United States had lost the war, the colonies had lost the war, then they would have probably lost their lives. Declaration of Independence itself was written to King George and the rest of the world, explaining why they were declaring their separation from England, why they were declaring their independence. The opening portion of the document is known as the preamble, and it explains the purpose of the document. It reads, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote general welfare, and secure blessings of liberty." So there's 6 purposes of the Declaration of Independence listed there in the preamble. It's also a list of 27 grievances or complaints against King George in Parliament, the British lawmaking body. It served as a declaration of war against Great Britain and declared the colonies a free United States of America. All right, so that's the last slide. That's the end of this presentation. I know it was a little longer than we're used to, but there was a lot of stuff to cover. And I wanted to make sure that we covered, or that I covered everything in this presentation that was going to be leading up to the tests that you'll have next week. So this will be the last of the new information that we're covering for the new test. And from here on out, we'll be working with this information, reviewing and preparing for the test that you'll have next week. So I look forward to seeing you in class, and good luck studying.